The house on Ashwood Lane. It had been abandoned for over a decade, and still it whispered. Ashwood Lane was a quiet street that veered off into the woods, secluded from the bustling life of the town. No one really paid attention to the old house at the end of the lane, but that didn't mean they didn't know the stories. To the locals, the house was cursed, a relic of unspeakable horrors that had transpired within its walls. Over the years, rumors swirled like leaves in the wind, about the family who once lived there, about the strange disappearances, about the blood that had stained the floors. But none of that was enough to deter Danny. He wasn't one to believe in superstition or folklore. What really interested him was the house itself, the mystery of it, the reason it had been left untouched for so long. When he first moved to the town, he had heard bits and pieces about the house from the older residents. They spoke in hushed tones, as if the mere mention of it could bring the horrors of the past back to life. But Danny wasn't one for idle gossip. He was a man of action, always looking for the next adventure. The house on Ashwood Lane was the perfect opportunity for him to prove that there was nothing to fear. It had been 6 months since he'd moved into the town, and the house had only grown more fascinating to him. On a particularly chilly autumn evening, with the sky painted a dusky purple, Danny decided it was time to see the house for himself. He didn't tell anyone of his plans. He didn't want to be dissuaded by the warnings, the dire warnings he had heard from the locals. The house stood at the end of Ashwood Lane, barely visible through the tangled trees and overgrown ivy. Its once white facade was now stained a grim shade of grey, and the windows were like hollow eyes, staring into the void. It was a house that had been forsaken, and yet there was something undeniably compelling about it. He crossed the threshold of the rusted gate, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, as he walked up the uneven path. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was pulling him in. The door, half rotted and barely hanging on its hinges, creaked open at his touch, groaning like a beast waking from slumber. Danny hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. He stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered in the corners. Cobwebs draped over the furniture like forgotten memories. The house seemed to groan and shift around him, as if it were alive. But he dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the weight of his own unease. The front hall opened up into a spacious living room, its large windows long since boarded up. What remained were remnants of a once grand home. A fireplace, cracked and cold, a staircase leading to the upper floor, its wooden banister twisted and splintered. There was a thick layer of dust on everything, the remnants of a life that had been abandoned too soon. Danny's curiosity drove him forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he explored room by room. But as he moved deeper into the house, he began to feel watched. The sensation was subtle at first, like a prickle on the back of his neck, but it grew stronger as he moved further into the house. His heart began to beat faster. There was something not right here, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He paused in the hallway, his eyes scanning the walls. There were faint marks, old and faded, almost like scratches. It could have been from furniture, or maybe from the house settling over time, but Danny wasn't so sure. His gaze lingered on the marks for a moment too long, and a shiver ran down his spine. In the distance, he heard something. A faint sound like a whisper, or perhaps the wind rattling the windows. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the long, empty hallway stretching into the darkness. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But Danny wasn't one to back down. He took a deep breath and continued onward, pushing past his growing sense of unease. He came to a door at the far end of the hallway, its frame slightly crooked, the wood warped. It was the only door in the house that hadn't been destroyed by time or neglect. He reached for the handle, his fingers trembling. The door opened with a groan. Inside was a small room, its walls bare except for a single faded photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. It was of a family, 2 parents and a young child, all smiling, their faces frozen in time. The image seemed to warp and distort as Danny stared at it, the smiles twisting into something almost sinister. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him. The photo was the only thing in the room. but it felt like there was something more hidden beneath its surface, something sinister lurking in the corners. Without